everybody. This presentation is about a research project on names in adoption, and I'm leading that project, and today we're also going to hear from the project researchers Jan and Hannah, and the other people involved in the project are Amanda Coffey and Eve Makes. So our presentation is going to start by me locating the topic in my broader work, and then we're going to have a quick look at what is already known about the topic of names in adoption, and then we're going to move on to talk about the design and methods of this adoption and names study. So this is an ongoing study. We're very much in the kind of early to middle stages of this study. So we're going to talk about the design and methods of the study, and then we're going to present some preliminary emerging themes that we've already noticed in the data. So how does this project on names and adoption fit into my broader work on names? I use names essentially. I'm a sociologist, and I use names essentially to study issues around identities and inequalities. So names matter for people's individual identities, how they identify themselves, how other people identify them as individuals. But names also matter for people's identities of belonging, including in terms of belonging in family and kinship groups, but also groups in terms of ethnicities and other heritages. One line of my work has been on names and gender, in terms of both identities and inequalities. And it's this route around names and gender that really got me thinking about names in terms of kinship and families. It's within families, of course, that we get our names. We are given our names. One of the phrases when we're talking about names is what is your given name? But we get given both our forenames and our surnames by our families. So families are kind of engines, if you like, in terms of generating names and therefore generating name-linked identities. And these names that we get given become such an important part of who we are and our sense of ourself. When we're thinking about adoption, of course, things get even more complicated and even more interesting, because a child moves from their birth family, where they've already most often been given a set of names by their parents, their birth parents, to a new adoptive family, where those adoptive parents also might exercise their parental rights to name or rename their children. So there's a lot going on in adoptive families around names and identities, even more so than in other family types. And these are indeed the very reasons why I wanted to do a study on names and adoption, because of the kind of extra layer of complexities around names and identities for people with experiences of adoption, either as adoptees or as adopters. When I started looking at this topic, it became very clear that research on adoption and names is pretty scarce, and I'm talking worldwide. There's not very much worldwide in terms of research evidence about names and adoption. I think there are two reasons why that happens. One is that names themselves are taken for granted, and they have been taken for granted by researchers from a range of different disciplines. Two is the nature of adoption itself. So adoption, of course, is a very complex process or set of processes, at the centre of which is a child whose early life experiences have been difficult, if not traumatic. So where adoption researchers have kind of focused their attention, quite rightly, is on child welfare issues, and they've been less concerned with identity issues. So those two factors in combination, names being taken for granted per se, but also the particular focus of concern of adoption researchers, means that nobody's kind of focused on the relationship between names and identities in adoption, or very few people have. because there is a small body of evidence on names in adoption. There have been studies, for example, in America, typically, of international adoption. So this is where a child is adopted from another country and by American parents and taken to live with them in America. And here, names have been looked at particularly in the context of international adoptions. And names have been shown to be important in terms of the heritage of the child, with some adoptive parents where the child is from another country, using names to kind of like honour the birth heritage of the child. They retain the child's original, for example, Vietnamese forename to kind of respect the birth heritage of that child. Other parents in international adoptions choose to assimilate through making choices that of a name which is an American, English name, rather than the original birth name of their child. So whether parents practice culture keeping by keeping the child's original birth name, or culture assimilation, where they rename the child with the American English forename, names are shown to matter here in terms of the adoptees' names and the decisions made by parents about that. So that's one set of studies. International adoptions. In the UK, international adoptions are very few and far between. So that set of findings from those studies of international adoptions may or may not be relevant to the UK context, where domestic adoptions are by far the majority type. In other studies of adoption, including of adoption in the UK, names might not have been the focus of those studies, but they've nonetheless come up. And I've been able to identify within those studies, who was looking at a range of different topics, some findings relevant to thinking about names in adoption. So these kinds of studies have shown, sort of inadvertently, I guess, how names in adoption can be ways of cementing belonging through, for example, naming a child after a family member, to bring the child into the kind of family history and the family relationship links. Or conversely, names can sometimes be shown to be getting in the way of adoptive family life. So, for example, in open adoptions where children might have letterbox contact with their birth parents, the birth parent might use the child's birth forename, whereas the name of that child might have been changed by the adoptive parents. So in these studies of adoption where names have kind of come up inadvertently, there is evidence of names acting both to cement belonging and to kind of disrupt belonging as well. When we're thinking about names in adoption, and specifically if we're thinking about names in adoption in England and Wales, which is the context for the study that's currently underway, it's important that we think about the differences and we understand the differences between the kind of pre-1970s era and culture of adoption and the post-1970s era and culture of adoption. Basically, post-1970s, we've had a shift towards more open adoptions, where previously adoptions were closed and secretive. So part of that secrecy was very much about names, the birth forenames of the child, for example, or the names of the birth parents. As part of that shift over time, there have been changes in the typical profile of adoptees. So pre-1970s, the typical adoptee was a baby under 1 year old who had been taken away or encouraged to be given up by typically an unmarried mother because of the kind of social and sexual values of the time. Nowadays, typical adoptees are older children, they're children over the age of 1, and they're often in sibling groups. So even if the child itself doesn't remember what its birth name might be because it's too young. It might have a sibling, an older sibling who remembers names of birth parents, of what the younger sibling's original birth name was, and so on. So essentially, the shift in the kind of culture and practice of adoption pre-1970s and post-1970s means that there's been a shift too from not knowing about names, whether we're talking about the names of adoptees or the names of birth family, or indeed the names of adopters, to knowing about these things. So there's less secrecy, there's more openness, there's more understanding and knowledge around names than previously. And this openness in contemporary adoptions is amplified further when we think about the shift towards digital societies post-1970s, where names now can be very easily used. If you know someone's name, you can use that name to trace and make contact with people that you want to get in touch with, which has obviously a significance for people affected by adoption. So what I'm saying then is that names matter in adoption because they have all these entanglements. They're entangled with adoptive relatives and birth relatives. They are entangled with adoptive family making. And they're important too, of course, for the long-term identities of people who are adoptees. So for all these reasons, I wanted to do a study of names in adoption. And I'm going to pass over now to Jan, who's going to share with you the details of that study.
Thank you. So this study, the Names and Adoption Study, is the first study of this kind in the UK. As Jane mentioned, some minimal research has been undertaken in the US context, but often in the international adoption context. This particular project is funded by the Leverhulme Trust and runs for 2 years. We're looking at qualitative interviews and creative writing, which again makes this quite a unique project. So it's a 2-stage online research project. It's completely designed to be a remote project. There are 30 people who are adoptees that will be taking part and 30 people who are adoptive parents. This is from any time period. All of these are adults, so people aged 18 plus. And as Jane mentioned, because of the different experiences pre-1970s and the more closed adoptions, we're anticipating getting people from both groups, so pre-1970s adoption experiences and post-1970s open adoptions. This is also because the attitudes towards name change did change within that. So pre-1970s, it was seen as more acceptable to automatically change forenames and middle names, whereas the latest thinking is that to protect the child's identity and the gifting from their birth parents, that names are, it's acceptable to keep those names, and indeed it's encouraged to do so. So looking at the project and how we've gone about designing the project, we've chosen, as I said, the 2-stage project. So the creative storying that we're doing, it has been designed to bring forth the kind of, it's appropriate for sensitive research and especially for identity research and identifying that multiplicity of selves. The creative process, as Gauntlet says, brings about, it touches another part of the brain and brings about other concepts and reflections on people's sense of identity that they may not have thought of before. So our creative storying is providing a booklet with a number of prompts that guide the participant through the experience of looking at their name stories. In this way, it can make the familiar stories that they've had strange again. So to them, it brings about that greater reflexivity, and they go beyond possibly this verbal mode of thinking. The participants can come back to their booklet, they can change their story, they can reflect on their story, and at the end we also ask them to reflect on the process of their story, which has again given more insights into how participants have felt about undertaking this creative aspect of the research. Also, the usefulness of tangible objects. So participants can choose to show us documents, identity documents, photographs, mementos, and objects they may have been given throughout their life, which are important to their sense of identity or their sense of heritage, whether that be connected to the birth family name or the current name that they are choosing to use. So if we look at those two stages, moving on to the next page, so the creative writing that I touched on there and why we've chosen it, some of the questions within it are, as you can see on the slide, completing statements from where they come from. So again, it's looking at heritage. It's deliberately left ambiguous, so that where I come from, it's not directing them to their adoptive family. If it's the adoptees, it could be any particular aspect of their life they choose from. So often people will look at their heritage. Some adoptees will use both their birth heritage and adoptive family to describe place and people. Listing of names, specifically we ask people to reflect upon their names. If it's adopters, we ask to look at the reflection on the names chosen for their children, if they changed the names, and if they didn't, why didn't they change their names, and the discussions around that really. Within this creative writing booklet, there's also accompanied by a video. So the 12 prompts are then, people are guided through with the video, which is on YouTube, but is a private video, so can only be accessed by the participants via a link, and also no participants can see who else has accessed it, so it's completely private. And we've had feedback that this video has been really useful for people. They've found it a real kind of comfort to guide them through the booklet. You can see the example on here. One of the questions is, do names matter? And we're using excerpts from poetry, from storying, to encourage people to tell their story. And the poetry that's been used has been taken from people that have written about their own experiences regarding adoption or adoptee status. And that's prompted some good discussions. So within this, we've found that people really do reflect about their name changes and extend the questions themselves, and even writing their own questions. And at the end, some people, there's plenty of space for people to reflect not only on the process, but on other things that they may have liked to have been asked that we didn't ask them. For us, one of the key factors in the booklet, the most interesting part maybe, has been the letter that people write to somebody, whoever they choose, to the named child, if it's adoptive parents, or if adoptees, adult adoptees, often choose to write to birth parents, but also write to their adoptive parents. And this letter can be obviously a very personal document. It's explicitly written that they're not going to send this. So people are very open within this letter and produce a very moving document, very insightful. So as I say, this is the two-stage process. And the second stage of the process is a follow-up of digital interviews. So within this, we draw specifically on the participants' creative story work. So each of the researchers will go back and look in detail at the booklet, drawing the name stories within the booklet and rewriting our indicative interview with those particular thoughts in mind. So we might comment about, you say in your booklet, about specifically and going into detail about their specific changes they might have documented or what was significant to them. So we're always orientating our questions towards what is of significance to the participants. We're looking at how their name reflects who they are and whether they can talk us through the decisions. And for adopted parents, for example, we'll ask about the training that they may have experienced on naming in the adoption process and how differently they found that in reality with their own experiences to do with changing names. And again, we'll ask about objects and documents, which, as before, within the interview can build up a good rapport with people. And I've had people show photographs which have been very significant to them and they want to share that. And again, that builds up a rapport, which can be a challenge online, although we've found the online interviews to be very productive. So moving on to the ongoing project as we are at this point in time. So far we have had 40 creative writing booklets completed. This is 21 by adoptees and 19 by adopters. Of these, we've had 30 follow-up interviews so far completed, 19 with adoptees and 11 adopters, and another 9 interviews are lined up to take part in the next few weeks. At present, we have more female than male participants, and in terms of ethnicity, 23 of our participants are identified as white, 4 as mixed or multiple heritage, and 1 as other traveller. 2 of our adopter couples have identified as gay, and in terms of the pre-1970s cohort, we have 15 adoptees, mainly around the 1960s, and no adopters so far 1970, which is something we'll be addressing later on in the project. Post-1970s cohort, we have 4 adoptees around the 1980s and 19 adopters post-2016, with the children ages ranges from 6 months to 2 years at the point of adoption. And some participants are both adoptees and adopters, so that's an extra special category there, but they're identifying as either an adoptee or an adopter for the purposes of the research, but obviously they have a more complicated story as well. So now I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague Hannah.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to talk briefly through some of the ethical considerations that we faced in the design of this research project. So the first thing to know is the sensitivity of the adoption life stories that we're exploring. Whatever stage of the adoption process our participants are at, whether it be a newly adopted parent in recent years or an individual who was adopted decades ago, their story is having to be handled sensitively as they've all been through some sort of emotional journey. We're also raising questions that they may not have thought about for some time, or in some cases perhaps never thought about. Some of the questions we pose to them, they'll say we haven't really thought about it in that sort of way before. So we're being very conscious of that. And the dynamics within the adoption triad, which is the relationship between the adopter, the adoptee and the birth family, is likely to be complicated and varied over time, and therefore we've given a great deal of consideration on how to best ethically and sensitively explore these research questions. And as Jan just described, our awareness of this is reflected in our research methods, and we are hoping that the creative writing element is somewhat therapeutic or helpful to participants. One ethical consideration we've given a lot of thought to is the issues surrounding anonymity and the use of pseudonyms. So in qualitative research, it's often assumed that anonymisation is the best or standard practice. However, in recent times, this has begun to change, with researchers arguing this isn't always the best approach. And Jane and I found in previous research focusing on the pronunciation of student names, that often when telling name stories, participants want to use their real first name, and actually in letting them do so, you can improve the quality of the data that's collected. So in short, retelling people's name stories without their names can be difficult for many reasons. And due to this experience, and after lots of consideration, we decided to let participants in this study choose whether to use their real first name. They can alternatively choose a pseudonym for themselves or allow us to choose one for them. All other information is anonymised, such as surnames, names of individuals mentioned, other identifying information. So in making this decision, we wanted to ensure that our participants were fully informed when making the decision whether to use their name or not. So we produced this information sheet. This is given to participants prior to the completion of their consent form. So this includes details of what a pseudonym is, because we're aware that as researchers it's a term we take for granted and other people might not know what we're actually asking them. Information whether they should choose one or not, considerations they should take into account, what this will mean for the data they provide to us, and some tips on how to choose an appropriate pseudonym and some examples. One important thing to note here is that we do make clear in this sheet that even when participants choose their own pseudonym for themselves, we make it clear we might not be able to use it. And the reason for this, again, comes from previous experience where the choice of pseudonyms can be complicated in retelling name stories. If someone chooses a pseudonym for themselves, it might not match their story, and therefore their name story can lose its context. A good example of this is a participant from a previous study whose name story centred around their name sounding just like a Premiership footballer, and the pseudonym they chose did not sound like a footballer, so in retelling their story it no longer made sense. So this information sheet lets people know we'll try to use your pseudonym, but we might not always be able to do so. And in our ethics application, this form was actually complemented by the assessors. We believe that it is helping us to ensure we get fully informed consent from our participants regarding the use of their name. And their consent form that they fill in after reading their sheet then allows them to choose a specific field, whether they would like to go ahead and use their name or choose a pseudonym. So that's just a brief overview of some of the ethical considerations we've taken into account for this study. And now we're going to move on to talk about some preliminary findings. So we're going to talk about some preliminary themes that are emerging from the data. And we do hesitate to call these findings at this stage. As Jan spoke to, we are in the process of doing the interviews, about halfway. New themes are emerging all the time, and we are exploring issues all the time that come up. So these are just some things that have caught our sociological interest, and that, like I say, we do hope to explore in more depth through the course of the rest of the study. So the first theme we're going to talk about is linked to adoptive parents and surnames. And what we found is that surname change is seen as an important part of the adoption process. And for an adoptive parent, they often speak about how this is almost an essential part of the process of adopting a child. It's often taken for granted that they would change the name away from the birth surname of the child to one that matches their family. Sometimes this can be changing the surname to a name that already is the couple or the individual surname, or changing all of the family surnames so that they match. But the key part of this is that they do match. They are part of the family by sharing a surname. And as this quote shows, you completed Team Evans. And as this bottom quote shows, it says, I jumped for joy the day you finally became a Wilson. And this is reflected in some of the other quotes from the adoptive parents, that day when they actually share a surname is seen as a key part of their family making process. And people spoke about it as an easy decision to change the surname. And often when we ask about surname change, they talk about it as we had to. We had to for protection, for anonymity going forward. It's not debated as much as, say, the change of a forename or a middle name would be. So moving on to the next theme is linked to adoptees and their surnames and feelings of belonging surrounding their surname. And what we found is that often feelings about surnames can change over time for adoptive people. Often becoming an adult and sharing your surname with a spouse or with a child can actually change how people feel about their own surname. As this middle quote shows, they say, having my own child, I love the fact that she has my surname. The only genetic mirror I have in my life gives real meaningful context to my name. And for this individual, who was an adult adoptee, spoke about how they'd never really connected to their surname that was given to them by their adoptive parents. But then when they had a daughter who carried that name from them, they really felt a sense of belonging to it. So their feelings had changed over the course of their life. We did find some other adoptees, like this quote on the right hand side says that they'd never felt any sense of belonging from their surname until they got married. So their adoptive surname never really meant as much to them, but when they chose a surname from the person that they were marrying, that was when they really got a sense of belonging from their surname. So people's feelings towards their surnames were complicated and very varied, and also changing over time dependent on their individual life circumstances at that time. So if we can move on to the next slide. So again, this is relating to adoptees and how they feel about name changes. And in a lot of respects here, we're talking about fore and middle name changes at this point. So adoptees often tell us that when they find out that their name had been changed or part of their name had been changed, they experience shock or confusion. And it's been described by several people as a sliding doors moment. And it feels like they sort of a life that they would have lived and a life that they did live. And the name change sort of represents that difference for them in a lot of cases. And whether adoptees like or dislike the name that they were changed to, they did most often feel like this had impacted on their sense of identity at some point during their life. Some had experienced a lot of confusion, conflict surrounding their identity and belonging because of this. Well, they say because it feels like part of the name change was involved in those issues throughout their life. And this had caused a lot of issues for people. A few adoptees have reverted back to birth names, forenames, because they felt like they never really belonged to the name that was given to them. However, it's important to note not all experiences are negative. Some adoptees have spoke positively about their name change. And one thing that we're beginning to see is that with younger adoptees, they're sometimes more positively speaking about that name change. But at this point, we are hoping to look at that further and the differences between pre-1970s and post-1970s and how that impacts on feelings surrounding name change. So one thing to note at this point is just that these experiences of name change and identity are very unique, very individual experiences. Some people are very happy with their name change, reflect really positively, whereas others, like we say, are actually reverting back to their birth surname. It's sort of in contrast or in conflict with that name that they were given when they were adopted. So these are just some of the themes that we're going to continue to look at through the rest of the project. So I'll hand back to Jane now.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, so those are some of the things that have caught our kind of sociological interest already in terms of the themes that are coming through the data. You know, we are at this stage where we're still on. It's an ongoing project, but we already think that we have some findings which could feed into, for example, the development of policy briefs or best practice guidelines for adoption professionals, for practitioners working in the adoption space, be they social workers or others. And also, importantly, we think we can feed through some of our findings and translate them into advice, guidance for people who are affected by adoption, both adoptees and adopters. As I mentioned right at the start, I'm a sociologist, so I'm also interested in how these data on names in adoption can feed into sociology, and particularly the sociology of identities. So I'm hoping that we can use these findings to show how and why names matter for people's embodied identities, for their well-being and for their relationships and for their broader set of experiences. Thank you so much for listening. You can see here on the slide some references that we've used during this presentation, and if you want to find out more about the project, we have a project website, adoptionstories.org.uk. If you go there, you can find some more information, including some samples from people's adoption stories about themselves that they've shared, particularly through creative writing with us. Thank you very much for listening. Bye for now.